We're back for another edition of the program, and my good buddy Marc Moschetto is here. He is with KickMotor, and he has a YouTube channel that I love. It's called The Rational Workforce.
Got it.
And well, I guess let's start there, Marc, because I do want to get into your background and what has brought you to where you are today. But starting the rational workforce, there had to be a reason behind that. And these are really good videos, really well done, well produced, and they definitely have a point of view that is common sense, and it's not everywhere these days. So tell me about how the rational workforce started.
It makes sense to me. So I don't know, maybe common sense comes into play somewhere. But yeah, so the real quick background there is that, and it's a little intertwined with my background as well, but I'm a former tech CMO. I've been in B2B technology my entire life, marketing. I had a couple of detours into the world of journalism, but for the most part, that's been my bag. And for the last, gosh, probably 15, 20 years or so, I've been really focused on like the HR technology space. So I spent a lot of time in those circles. And, I noticed there was so much that was going on in that space in and around HR practitioners where there seemed to very much be an orthodoxy of thought. And as much as there are all these discussions about bring your authentic self to work and you be you and it'll be great, you could really only do that as long as your you being you fit into a box. And as time went on, and this kind of really started kicking in around maybe 2019, 2020, I noticed the gap between just folks that I knew in and around my orbit that were in the workforce and what the HR practitioners were talking about. That gap kept getting wider and wider. And, again, there's this kind of orthodoxy of thought. So sometimes you try to voice these things into that marketplace and it was squelched or pushed back on, or you name it. I've got a lot of scars that I can go into at some point, but I just felt like there needed to be a channel where there could be a dispassionate view about things, where yes, you could talk about certain topics that are kind of at the cross section of pop culture or politics or workplace dynamics, where you're getting a couple of different viewpoints in. And that's really how the channel was born, and that's why I gave it the title, The Rational Workforce. It does come at it with a point of view, but I also try to play all the different angles a little bit and really surface discussions that I think, if you're just kind of solely mired in that HR tech echo chamber, if you watch these videos, you're going to get some different perspectives that will maybe influence the way you think, or at least help you to understand other people who are in your organization and what maybe motivates them. So long-winded answer, but did that tick the boxes for you?
It did, but I remember there was one point where you sent probably an X post that said, "Hey, check this video out." It was an excerpt, I think, from one of your videos. And that was the one that got you kind of over that 1,000 subscriber threshold. Can you walk me through the one that went, I guess, semi-viral?
Yeah, I actually had a couple that had a good pop on it. The first one was, do you remember the artist that sang "Rich Men North of Richmond"? And that was Oliver Anthony, I believe.
Yeah.
And that was, I just felt like that was such an anthem, and that really captured the way so many people were thinking, particularly folks that were in the workforce, and particularly folks that are blue collar. Like that's kind of my family's roots. My dad started blue collar and then eventually kind of moved into sales. But like, I don't know, I just, where I'm from, north of Boston, it's just, I identify there a lot better. So it resonated with me. And I did a video that was called Oliver Anthony is Pissing Off All the Right People. And it kind of unpacks that power dynamic and really, I mean, just shone a light on his music. But that went kind of viral. And then there was another one that almost hit as high from a view count. And by viral, I mean, 60 something thousand views on that one. And then this other one had in the 50s. But it was basically HR is melting down, and that's kind of a good thing. And the gist on that was, I think it was the New York Times that just published a story about how human resources folks were starting to get really burnt out, and they were feeling this crushing workload, and a lot of things that a lot of other people have been worrying about for a very, very long time. And that's my point, was that it's not an anti-HR, it's not an anti-workplace channel by any means. It's very much pro-worker. And I think, again, going back to that gap that we saw between the two worlds, I felt that, if that function is starting to feel some of the crushing pressure that so many of us in the workforce have had it already, I think it's a good thing, because now you're finding some common ground and you're finding some relatability, and maybe there can be, we'll turn up the knob on the empathy scale a little bit if you've got some of that commonality. So I never expected a post that specifically talked about HR in the title to kind of get mass appeal. But to me, that was validation that, there were folks out there that were getting kind of frustrated with a lot of the stuff that was going on. And again, I've been in and around that profession for, crawling up on 2 decades now. I've been blessed with remarkable HR people who have helped me through, my dad having Alzheimer's, and resources I could go to for that. And I had a child with a mental health crisis. I've got two of my children are autistic. Relocations, like you name it. I've had a lot of interesting bubble cases, and I've had incredible HR people who have helped me through. So this is not anti-HR at all. It's more of like hey, open your eyes. Let's have a richer view of the people that you ostensibly serve, and let's have better dialogue.
You were telling me earlier about the kind of the intersection between DEI work, so DEI writ large,
Yep.
and some of those concepts within DEI that get ignored. And you had mentioned the neurodivergent
Yeah.
universe as kind of being one of those categories that just isn't really considered. So talk to me about how that has unfolded, how you've seen that unfold.
Yeah, I think that, there are some organizations out there that really get it. And they tend to be in the tech community because, like, for example, both of my boys, I have 3 children, boy, girl, boy. Both of my boys are neurodiverse to some degree, right? And it's called a spectrum for a reason, man, right? Because like one is very quiet and bookish and likes to keep to himself, hyper intelligent, like plays 5 instruments, speaks a couple different languages. Like that's him. My other, equally brilliant, but in a completely different direction. And he is like my extrovert times 10, which I am not. So I'm like, well, kid, where'd that come from? But they both have different and unique ways of seeing the world. And both of them, when they are engaged, my God, man, you can't get them off whatever topic or task or whatever they're dialed into. And like, how wonderful is that as a worker? And again, I lean towards tech, right? Because particularly in the coding community, when you can just like get in your zone and hit your flow state, it's awesome. So, in this discussion about diversity and inclusion, I really feel like neurodiversity should be a big part of that equation. And it's also something that lifts all boats, right? Like if you look at the statistics on the rise in incidence of neurodiversity, I mean, it cuts across all genders, all ethnicities, all economic lines, right? It's something that impacts everybody. So, I just felt like organizations, as they start to embrace diversity and true inclusion and get serious about it, they should be part of it. And what I found by participating in these discussions and going to these sessions and roundtables and everything like that is that it really wasn't. And I've become a little bit of that pain in the ass in the room when these things are going on, because they'll open the mic and I'll be like, hey, talk to me about best practices around neurodiversity and inclusion for folks that could use help there. And the predominant response has been one of two. One is like either totally ignored, and downplayed, or we acknowledge that's important. It's not as important as these other things that we have going on right now too, which, we can go down chapter and verse. I think everyone knows kind of what the DEI stuff focuses on. So it just struck me as a little bit hypocritical, right? Like, do you truly believe in embracing actual diversity and actual inclusion, or is that lowercase stuff? And then like diversity of thought, forget that. Diversity of opinion. And I think that's really harmful for a business, is when you start to have this monolithic way of thinking. And then another big thing that I'm seeing right now is that, again, particularly in the tech sector, ageism seems to be a pretty common, if not wholeheartedly endorsed ism. And there's content we have in the channel where we unpack that quite a bit. There's a lot of surprisingly open comments about older workers, including one very, very large tech organization that goes by a 3-letter acronym, who called them dino babies. And in an open conversation with their HR team on email, saying we need to squeeze out these dino babies so we can get younger, cheaper talent in, so we look cooler and hipper. And stuff like that sends me sideways, man. We either believe in creating a diverse workforce or not. And the other thing too is I don't want to sound callous to the progress that's been made in that area. There's been a lot. And some organizations that serve that space have been saying, look, guys, we need to make some changes, because if we don't, change is going to be forced upon us and we might not like it. And when the organization made that statement, there was an awful lot of ugly pushback about it. Fast forward 12 months, Trump's in office. You've got all these mandates coming down. It's like, it was that orthodoxy of thought. They didn't want to listen to maybe changes needed to happen. And now they're in the situation they're in. So I'm afraid that a lot of the progress that's been made to date could get thrown out with the bathwater, and then everyone's kind of starting from square one. So again, those are the types of things that we tackle. It's the types of things that have made me unpopular in certain circles in the industry I serve. But it's also part of why I wanted to punch out of corporate after my last CMO gig and do my own thing, was so I could pursue these things and not worry about, am I gonna piss off my board? Am I gonna piss off my investors? Like, what are they gonna think? Folks are free to think what they want. I let my work speak for itself.
Yeah, that's a great philosophy. There's something that's been rattling around in my head as an idea on all this. And so my background, going back 20 some odd years, I worked for the precursor to it's called Aon Consulting, the precursor to Aon Hewitt, and then
Oh,
now
sure.
it's known as Alight. But back then we did our work was with the HR suite. So it was benefits discussion, health and welfare, what do your plans look like? And then it was retirement plans and all that.
Nice.
But the big mantra, and I'll get to where I'm going with this in a second. The big mantra in all that was, we wanted to, in our role as consultants, empower the HR suite to, quote unquote, sit at the head table. And in some ways, we were effective in getting HR to look at itself and to be looked at an organization as being more strategic than it had been in the past, because it was the personnel department. You got to fill out the paperwork, you got to put up the sign in the break room,
Compliance,
and then your
compliance,
job gets
compliance.
done. Right. Here's where I'm going with this. I think folks like you, who are communicators, might have been among the first actual communicators actually in this space advocating for the head table stuff. If you think about communications, and maybe we're 10, 12, 15 years into the rise of the chief communications officer, and I have thoughts about that,
Yeah.
because in a lot of cases you're elevating a practice that you're not ready for. But there have been ages, since the dawn of the internet, there have been people in our space, communications, who have been either overtly or covertly advocating for communications to have a seat at the head table, to be more strategic, etc.
Yeah.
And that's how I think you got more chief communications officers, you got more people looking at how is this going to be perceived, whatever this business decision is, how is this going to be perceived in the marketplace? And maybe that needed to happen first before the HR suite could have folks like yourself telling the story of, wait, here's why HR is really important too, and here's how you, HR professionals, can advocate your way into that quote unquote head table. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting perspective, and I think that I suspect you and I probably, if we compared notes in our thought around communications and chief communications officers and everything, we'd probably have similar views. But I feel like the communications component, both external communications and internal communications, is so critical. And on the internal communication side, it really needs to be deeply entwined with HR, right? Because HR ostensibly as that connective tissue between the business and like I see, they've got a really tough job, right? There's state and local authorities and their rules and regulations. There's federal, there's unions, there's the corporate's own standards, and then you've got individual workers. And like they're the hub of all that stuff. And it's ugly and not easy. And you got to keep a lot of plates spinning. You got to juggle a lot of stuff. So they don't have it easy. But I think that there probably have been some missteps along the way that's so entwined with communication that it's spooked companies and big brands. And I think they're the elevation of these senior communication roles might be more of a function of fear than kind of organic recognition that storytelling is important and that narrative thread has to run throughout inside and outside the business. But like, we'll give an example. Target, right? So Target originally got pushed back from the right because of, you name any number of things, their bathroom policy, their Pride Month collection, what was in it, who were the artists behind it, right? This is an apolitical statement. It is a reporting of the news. There was a push from the right and a boycott of Target, and they felt it. And they backed off that. And then as part of that reaction is they dramatically reshaped their DEI policy and they kind of deprioritized some of their, to my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, I should give that disclaimer. They deprioritized some of their like purchasing policies from minority communities, which caused yet another backlash. So, when you're a major brand like that and you take these stands, you either take your stand and you stand firm in it and you weather the storm, or you kind of go with whatever way the winds are blowing and you're going to suffer the consequences on either end of that. And I think that's an organization, we can probably think of a dozen more, that needed to have some clarity around really defining who they are. What do you stand for? What are your ethics and values beyond pretty words you put in a website? What are you willing to stand for and believe as a company? And then everything you do that communicates out from that cascades from that North Star. And that's a lot of what I do with KickMotor, plug, my consultancy that I've been running for coming up on 7 years now. I help organizations do that, right? So I think there's a big part of that. Hold on, my phone's ringing. Let me get rid of that. I think that the companies are tuning more into getting that sort of stuff done. And then HR having a quote unquote seat at the table. Been talking about that for 20 plus years. And yeah, absolutely, they should be. They need to be more than just the compliance committee, right? And 2020, starting with George Floyd and the stances that companies needed to take there, flowing into COVID, and what's the remote policies going to be, and how are you going to set that up, flowing into return to work or hybrid. They've went from looking for that seat at the table to being under a microscope. And sometimes that quick shift requires not just a sense of, change management and kind of reorienting how you think as an organization, but also the communication piece to go along with it. So it's the two I see are very, very intertwined, but there's definitely analogs between, the elevation of both of those roles as being seen as important and strategic as they really should be.
Yeah, and then you run into the challenge, and I'm sure we've both faced this at some point in our career, where you've got the good. I mean, you mentioned you've worked for some great HR folks, as have I.
Yeah.
Um, we've probably both interacted with or worked for some really talented communications leaders. Um, and then there are kind of those who, well, let's say externally might be perceived to be missing the mark, but I wonder if part of that is when you get to an organization. Target might be a great example of this. You get to an organization and you wonder how much they're actually listening to the advisors that are telling them do this, do that, and how loud or how vocal. We're seeing some of this now, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that because you mentioned Target. Um, it's my channel. I'll take the blows on this, but there's a lot going on specifically around Target and what is happening in Minneapolis and Minnesota. They're headquartered there. And part of it, you talked about what happened with Pride Month and maybe the narrative shift over here, and now it needs to be shifted back this way because of post-Trump DEI stuff. Now we're back in the other end of the spectrum, maybe again, where the question from the left is no matter what you say, you saw the letter, I'm sure, that came out from
It's like 60
yeah,
companies.
60
Yeah.
Minnesota CEOs, um, which was a tale full of sound and fury. It really didn't say anything. I mean, it really just kind of said, we're going to put our logos up and then we're going to take whatever is thrown at us. And I think Target has been, I've noticed a lot of online chatter. I haven't studied how much of it is one direction or another, but it appears to be a lot of people are blaming Target for not saying enough. And this is being done in the background of people going actually to Target and taking baskets of stuff and going up to the front and saying, I'm not buying this, and also everybody needs to walk out. And then on the other hand, you've got people saying, well, wait a minute, they were actually going into Target and taking, ICE was going into Target and taking people out of Target. So I guess the question here is what's a company to do and who do they listen to, and what's the what do you do when you're at a company where the advice is perhaps nodded in agreement to and then ignored?
Yeah. And I mean, I think this is such a slippery slope, right? Because this is where, you know, as a brand, you decide you're going to be getting into the activism game. There's a double-edged sword with that, right? Like on one hand, principle, here's what we stand for. We plant our flag and we are like standing strong until we see evidence proving us otherwise. Like that makes a statement about who you are. You may lose customers because of it. You may attract more customers because of it, but there's at least something that's ascribed to your brand that has a level of permanence. And more importantly, it reflects that you're willing to stand by your commitments, right? I think that where you get into trouble is when you waver, right? And I just read something this morning where Apple put out a statement as well, calling for I forget the exact phrasing of it, but basically a de-escalation of frustration. And I mean, they're getting called out for not being harsh enough. And look, the bottom line is this: when you put out a milk toasty message, don't be surprised if consumers ascribe that as one of your brand values. That, by the way, you can do all the work you want. The consumer is ultimately the one who defines what your brand stands for. You can influence it, but at the end of the day, when you start getting involved with things like this, you have to be prepared for the consequences you put out there. Now, my personal feeling on that, and I come from an immigrant family. My great grandparents came over from Sicily, so we had a couple of generations. The Sicilians weren't exactly welcomed with open arms and warm embraces for a couple of generations there. But I'm entirely sympathetic to what that immigrant experience is. I'm also entirely sympathetic to the fact that there are rules, there are laws, there are ways to do things and ways to not do things. So this is very much one of those situations where, as much as I just cautioned against taking that middle road, I don't think there's a hard and fast, clear snapshot of how to deal with this sort of stuff. There's no rule book, there's no playbook that we can lift from this with brands being compelled to be activists. So again, I get back to that. What is your North Star as a company? What do you stand for? And, I personally feel like, look, there's a lot of things that go on out there. There's a lot of things swirling in the ether. I choose to focus on what are the things that make us common? What are the things that we all embrace? And it could be doing great work. It could be standing by your word. KickMotor, it's largely myself. But then because I'm older than dirt and I've got a great network of people that I can pull in for different projects based on what my clients need, it's one plus. And our whole thing is we're going to over deliver. We're never going to nickel and dime, and we're going to focus on the work and the energy, and we're going to work with organizations that largely are driving to make the workplace a better place for everyone. And like, that's my sphere. I don't black out my logo in February. I don't rainbow up my logo in June. That's not waters that I want to wade into. People will know my heart and my head by my actions. And, maybe I'll take some lumps for that policy, but it's the policy I'm standing by. So, taking a look at these 60 companies and them slapping their logo on it and like calling for civility, calling for a de-escalation shouldn't be a bad thing. But take a look at the actors on either side of that ball that are pushing really hard for them to say more and do more. They've got their own vested interests that they're trying to push as well. And, like it or not, if you're employing 10,000 people, there's probably a pretty good chance that at least half of them are going to disagree with any hard stance you take. And you gotta play out those numbers and figure out what you want to be and let it flow from there. I feel like I just talked in circles, but does that?
You did not. I don't think so. But one of the things that I'm hearing is, I mean, obviously we're both Gen Xers. Well, not obviously because we both look like millennials, but
Are you kidding me? I go out with my wife and they're like, "You're taking your grandfather out. How nice. When does he do back at the home?" You look like a millennial, but go on.
well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I've been, and I'm also new to the facial hair. Um,
I tried
and
it, man. I couldn't. I break out like a teenager under there. I couldn't do it.
yeah, but but one of the things that you've talked about with me before that I want to zero in on, and maybe this might be helpful in the light of everything else that's going on, is the concept of disruption natives. So, and let me aim for an aim for a definition of that. It's kind of like we Gen Xers have been through a lot of disruption. And because we've lived through a lot of this disruption, when you see things exploding on either side, we're the ones with our arms crossed, kind of standing there going, all right, now what do we need to do? Uh, and I really like that concept. So let me know, did I get the definition right? And how would you make that work in an organization?
Yeah, and you did. You did for the most part. You nailed it, right? So my kind of coining that phrase comes from, it's a play off digital natives, right? Where, we heard for so long that you want to stack the deck with all the digital natives and they were born with the technology and they can adapt quickly and all that fun stuff. All true, right? But when you, going back to your point, when you look at times of massive disruption, which it feels like there's a massive disruption point, like at least twice a decade that companies have to roll with. You want people where that is second nature to them, right? Where disruption is part of the game. And we've lived through world turning upside down, How do you push through it, and how do you lead teams to excel through the other side of it? Because the cast of characters may change, but the underlying institutional knowledge it takes and experience it takes to lead teams through change, that's something that, just by virtue of trips around the sun, older workers, Gen X workers, and up bring to the table. And, when you think about what we've been through, right? Like, I got my first computer was a Commodore 64 that you hooked up to the TV set, right? And I
Yep.
got a new one for Christmas. I'll have to,
Oh,
we'll,
that's awesome.
we'll take details after, but a company revived the brand and they're making brand new Commodores. Anyway, I digress. So, like, that's how things started, like a Commodore computer with a tape drive. And then we got into, the internet came up, like AOL internet. And then laptops and mobile devices, and everything moved from installed software on a server to software up in a cloud. And now we've got AI. Geopolitically, the fall of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, 9/11, stock market, right? How many stock market crashes have we lived through as Gen Xers? So, like, economically, politically, socioeconomically, technology, our lives have been constant disruptions. And I think that we, are older workers, again, are kind of uniquely qualified to be able to help shepherd teams through that. And coincidentally, a lot of organizations, as they were going through and doing their layoffs, tended to get rid of the older workers who would be at the top of their salary band. And maybe if we nuke so and so, we can get two others plus save 15% under it. So they've flushed a lot of this institutional knowledge out of the workplace. And if you take a look at things like Gallup does an employee engagement index, that's been heading south for years. It's at or near the lowest point that it's ever been. Edelman does an Edelman Trust Barometer, and trust in every institution is down. And I think that trust in the workplace is highest out of, like, media and government. So, like, that's cream of the crap, right? You're number one in a very low bar that you needed to clear. But also, like, 40 points off from where best practices are. So we're seeing hard evidentiary data that things in the workplace are broken. And I think that we're seeing a lot of the things we've been talking about since the top of this call have contributed to that. So again, I go back to, we need to have more voices out there that are at least asking the questions. And we need to create an environment where questions can be asked, because that's where amazing growth happens. And that's where you don't get blindsided by things, especially competitors. I've, over my career, I think the largest team that I led was just north of 40. But, I've always kind of led large teams, and my teams were always diverse by default. And I mean, diverse in every measure, right? Economically, ethnically, gender, identity, sexuality. It doesn't make any difference. But when we got together and we had our team meetings and we were trying to noodle our way through a problem, or we had a new product coming to market and we wanted to, put our best foot forward, man, you need those voices. And as long as there's that foundation of trust and foundation of commonality that's poured at that baseline, you can have differing points of view up here. But at the end of the day, you're going to go out with something you can all stand behind. And we need more of that. And, like, I had the bar set pretty high with a couple of great, managers and CEOs that I worked for. One of the companies I worked for, two great things. I do, like, two quick stories about, like, examples of amazing leadership, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Same company. My dad, I'll try to get through this without crying. I have a hard time doing that, talking about my old man. But his Alzheimer's accelerated. And it was right at the point where our company was like, we went from being bootstrapped to like crushing it, to now we're looking at investment money, and we're launching in the UK, and we're acquiring a company in Sydney. And, like, I was part of the leadership team. So I needed to be on these calls and on those planes. And my CEO would call me the day before a trip, and he'd say, "How's your dad doing? How's your mom?" And if he didn't like what he heard, he'd say, "You know what? You're not coming on this trip. I'm going to dial you in for this 3-hour window that we need you, but otherwise I got your back. You focus on home." Like, you think I'm not going to take a bullet for this guy?
Yeah.
Right. And, we would go to the club trips whenever we crushed our numbers. You do President's Club, right? It's at some beautiful, all expenses paid tropical resort. And the year that my dad passed, we had qualified for club. And my wife and I love, as parents of three and my kids were young, it's like, oh my God, a week vacation where we can put our headphones in on the beach and not have to listen to like kids screaming. And if they are, it's not ours. Like, amazing. But the club trip was shortly after I lost my dad. And I went to my CEO and I said, look, you know how much Katie and I appreciate these trips, but my heart and head isn't into it right now. I don't want to waste the company's money. So I'm going to respectfully duck out, but I wanted you to know why I wasn't. He's like, I totally get it. I'll tell you what, when you and your family feel like you're ready, you let us know and I'm going to take care of a vacation for your team, for your family.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
come on, man. Like to this day, I take a bullet for that guy. And then the other story with him is that we used to have our 101 meetings and we'd go in, we'd have some big challenge we're tackling or some major decision for the business. And we'd go in his office and we'd sit in front of a whiteboard and we would not agree. I don't want to hang a number on it, but at least 40% of the time we'd be like, yeah, I don't think so. Some days it would be, hey, let's order in lunch. Some days it would be, let's order in lunch and dinner and then like go out and get cocktails after. But when that door opened up, man, we were in lockstep and you never knew who won the decision. We were just united. And I know it's long winded. You know me. That's what I do. But those examples, I think it's so powerful. And again, these were organizations that were inherently diverse by nature. And we just had this fundamental baseline of respect and we're all moving in the right direction. And my personal opinion, we need to get back to that. And we don't get back to that unless we listen to views that are probably counter to our own. And there's not enough of that going on.
So those are great. Those are great stories. And I think that I can think back to some really, really solid managers that I worked for. Um, but I can also think back to some not as solid managers.
Well, Adam, the good ones make those bad ones really effing bad, don't they?
Yeah, they do. But where I'm going with this question is, how do you know? And I'm thinking of this in light of yesterday. Amazon said 16,000 more layoffs,
Yeah.
and even over the last couple of years, it seemed to be there was a growth of people doing fractional work.
Yep.
Hey, I'll take this because I have to take this. And there, the point is, there are a lot of job seekers out there, and they always talk about you don't leave the company, you leave the boss when you leave. How do you know going in? I mean, I've actually had an interview where the the person, and I don't want to give too much of it away. Close friends will know exactly who I'm talking about. But the individual who interviewed me at one point said, "You remember in the Bible when Jesus said to Peter, 'Come with me, and I will make you fishers of men.' Well, that's how I feel with my company. Come with me, and I will make you a fisher of wealth." And what was kind of my
How did you
response.
react to that? Like, what was your, did you get the, oh, this is a person of faith, so maybe we'll jive? Or were you like, I don't think that's what Jesus meant? Like, what was your vibe?
It was the latter. It was the latter. Yeah. Long story over several beers about that whole experience. But
Well, we're next in the same zip code, brother. I'm buying. I want to hear them all.
but I guess what I'm pointing to is, how do you know, especially these days with everything, how do you know that there's the potential for someone to jive with?
Yeah, and this is a crappy cop outy answer, but I don't think you do. I don't think you do until you're in the mix and until you're confronted with something that's challenging, right? And you can ask all the hokey, right? I'm a firm believer that when you go on an interview, you're interviewing the company as much as vice versa. But just like I'm sure you, me, anyone that does the interview process, you have your pre-canned answers like, what's your weakness? And tell me one time when you, right? Like you kind of have your acceptable answers for it, but you don't really understand what things are like until you're in the thick of it. And like, we used to call them in college, we called them Velcro friends, right? Like you'd have friends that you're tight with, but sometimes you go through the ringer with them a couple of times and the Velcro wears off and you just don't stick together. Like, I think that you just don't really know until you're confronted with that situation. The way I try to do it is, and LinkedIn makes this easier, is that I try to ask around to people. If I can find people in the hiring managers network that I know, I'll reach out to them and I'll say, hey, look, I'm interviewing for a role. I'm talking to so and so. What's your impression of her? Like, what are your challenges? And, oftentimes I think that, again, if you've been in a space long enough, there's enough chatter, there's enough people that you can reach out to that you can get a sense of that. But the biggest thing, and this is the cop out piece, is trust your gut. Because I can name chapter and verse every time I interviewed with someone, and this is me going to work for them, not vice versa. I'm sure there's a lot of people who interviewed with me that was like, what an ass. But me interviewing with someone and my gut had said, man, something doesn't feel right with this. And my logic said, yeah, but the salary or the benefits or the title and then you get into that first don't see eye to eye situation and you realize that, oh, boy, did I make a mistake? So, that happens sometimes. Don't underestimate your gut. I think that today more often than in the past, there's been this kind of, you can't judge a book and you can't be discerning because discerning makes you some sort of an Easternism. Look, I mean, that not saying that doesn't happen, but when it comes to intuiting who you're talking to and who you're going to be shoulder to shoulder with in the trenches, sometimes your gut just doesn't lie and you need to listen to it. And then we've all been in the situations where you're like, oh my God, I need a job. I'll take it. Right? If the opportunity pops up, you take it and you could be pleasantly surprised. You look for something else. But every time I bumped into or started working for someone where it wasn't great, it's when I had to convince myself that my gut was wrong. And then my gut was like, yeah, you should have listened to me, right, kid? It just happens.
To
Exactly.
yeah, on the shoulders. Where this might be a little bit too much of a blue sky question, but I'll ask it anyway. Where does it all go from here? I mean, we look around, there's a lot, and it doesn't even matter where you are politically. It doesn't even matter where you are personally, philosophically, spiritually, whatever. There's a lot. And what's your advice for folks, I guess, like us, kind of Gen Xers in the middle? You don't want to make waves, you know how it is, but um there's there's a lot and we still need to be productive and we think we can be productive and we think that there's a lot to offer and we think there's a lot more. There's still some runway.
Yeah.
So what's your advice?
Yeah. I mean, I think that my advice for individuals is the same advice that I have for brands. What is your North Star? What are you about? What matters to you? What are your non-negotiables? And you stick to those guns. I think from a just navigating the turbulence of everything that's going on in the world, where like you're almost compelled to have an opinion on everything or compelled to share it, right? Like anyone can ask you any question that doesn't guarantee them the right that you need to respond to it, right? And like as much as I shit post on X, there's a lot of times I type something and I'll say, it's probably not a very godly thing to say, or, do I really need to weigh in on this matter? Who the hell am I? Like, just and delete it. So, I think that there's a way you can stick to your guns. There's a way you can define your North Star and stay with it, and not get pulled into the mud. And again, I focus in the workplace. I focus on what brings us together, what makes us united, what's the common goal that we're all pushing for. And whether I'm leading a team or whether I'm helping growth stage companies kind of figure out before they go full throated into the marketplace who they are and what they want to stand for and how they want to differentiate themselves, it's the same advice. You got to figure that out, and you got to stick with it. That doesn't mean that you're inflexible, right? Times change, disruption happens, right? We just talked about that. But your ethics and your core should be steadfast and fixed. And then once you do that, a lot of this other stuff turns out to be noise, right? Like, how many tempests in a teapot do you see flare up on social media and then plus 24 hours? And it's like, oh, well, that's a camera angle that I didn't see yesterday. This changes everything. Or, oh, this other little factoid came to light. Or, oh, it was a deep fake. Sorry. It's so easy to get sucked into instantaneous outrage. Just be quiet. Just be quiet. Still
What
your mind.
what's funny as you mention that is over the last several months, I've had that one image in my head of Prince William. Do you remember the image where there's a picture of Prince William and it looks like he is flipping somebody off? And that made the rounds forever. But it was from one angle
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
where all you can see is this. And
Yep.
then later a photo emerged from this angle, and lo and behold, this is what he's doing. And I think that's where we are with a lot of stuff. And the fear I've got, and I'll try to wax poetic on this rather briefly, but throw this concept at you. The fear I've got is that we have a whole bunch of folks, no matter where you are in the spectrum, on the political spectrum or the philosophical spectrum or whatever, we have a whole bunch of folks who are okay with anything as long as it is directionally correct. So here's the image of Prince William flipping somebody off, and the context is, well, he was flipping off whatever, and it supports your views, so therefore you're going to share that image. And well, that wasn't the actual image. However, I believe I'm directionally correct because Prince William supports my view.
Yep.
And it's really that's especially as AI comes in, and we've all seen the images from the last couple of weeks. I saw a great breakdown of a couple of images from both ends of the spectrum that were, and you had the White House sharing something of someone being perp walked. They were not crying, but they shared a picture of them crying. And they're like, well, it's okay. We're going to keep the memes going. So,
Yeah.
oh, wait, 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 wait. It's okay to share an incorrect image as long as it is directionally correct, which we saw with the death of Alex Preddy, and then the image of him that was shared directionally correct. It looks like him, and etc. And we don't
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
talk about all that. But I think also one of the North Star challenges that everybody's looking at is how do I find the things that support my worldview, support my North Star, but also how do I make sure that they are accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's, again, it goes back to your own, kind of internal discernment and beliefs, right? So yeah, I'll give you an example. I'll go back to my YouTube channel, right? The Rational Workforce. Some of those videos that had like the higher view counts within the comments for the same video. Alternatively, a loony lefty or a MAGA fascist. People are seeing the exact same content with the exact same words, and they're coming away with their own impression that they're coloring on that. And like, I try to apply that to just about everything, right? Because regardless of how I vote or how I feel, I definitely have viewpoints on things. But like, I have called BS on folks that I voted for and folks in my own party, and have called out things that are beyond the pale, and then you get pig piled on. It's like the tribalism is ever present now, and my degree is in journalism. That's originally where I thought I was going to go, and I kind of got an inside view on how that world works and said no thanks. But like, there's so much standpoints that people begin from, and then exactly what you talked about, like they can paint their own narrative onto it, and then it's directionally correct when they're proven wrong, right? Or they don't admit that they're proven wrong because there's another outrage happening in the news cycle, and they just move on to that one. And that's why, like, I come back to, you've got to be quiet. You've got to drown out some of that stuff. And it's tough for us that are marketeers and communicators, because we have to, like, I have to be well versed on all the different social media platforms. I have to spend time there to know what's popping and what memes are trending. And you've got to stay on top of the news. So it's harder, I think, in professions where you have to live in that world. But it's so important to just kind of quiet and go back to what makes you you, and process it through that lens. And like, I'm unapologetically Catholic, right? That's my view on the world, and I filter a lot of stuff that I hear and see through that lens. I also know that there are times when my own actions are profoundly not that. Like, I scroll through my timeline on X and I go, oh wow, that's, yeah, maybe I should delete that post because that wasn't very kind. So like, no one's immune to getting sucked into it, but the degree by which you can kind of quiet down the noise and focus on what's important to you, the better you're going to be. And I think about that even in the job search too, right? Because it's so easy to get wrapped up in the economy sucks and massive layoffs, and you've got these HR platforms that are AI driven, and they're ignoring people, and I'm not even getting through to the interview phase, but it looks like this job's perfect for me, and it's all futile. Quiet, right? Like, you understand, as someone who's been in the game for this long, that there are alternative approaches, alternative paths to finding opportunities. Use social media to your advantage. Use LinkedIn to try and find the hiring manager, and reach out that way. Do a little video of yourself to make yourself stand out. Like, anything you can do that's proactive and moving forward, and not just giving into the noise of how awful everything is. Or you might be like me. Like, after my last couple whistle stops as CMO, I got laid off twice in a row. And it wasn't for performance. It wasn't because I wasn't hitting my metrics. It wasn't for anything other than I either fixed what was broken, and now I was expensive headcount when there's other stuff that needed to be fixed. Or here's my story after a couple of beers. Like, after I got invited to an event at the White House, suddenly I became no longer a good cultural fit for the business. So that was an interesting one to unpack. But I got sick of it and I just punched out. And that's why I started KickMotor, because I didn't want to put myself through that ringer. And I knew I had more to give to the marketplace, and working with growth stage companies, which is kind of my wheelhouse. I really wanted to spend my time there and do so in a way where I wasn't forced to, either put on the mask or compromise or worry about, if I dared to have a different opinion, now I've got a target on my back. Like, life's too short. And, again, coming up on 7 years, never say never. There could be some company that'll sweep me off my feet, and it'll be an amazing opportunity. But in the here and now, man, I love doing what I'm doing, and it's a non-traditional path, but it's one that an increasing number of people are taking now.
I hear you on that. I was gonna add, I mean, this might be a good place to close, but since we did spend a decent amount of time talking about HR and talking about job searches, and I know there are a lot of people that are um, that are job searching right now. So I will end this with the question that always comes up is, do you have any questions for me? No, but what final, I mean, that last bit was really quite good,
Appreciate that.
as advice. What, if you had a final 30-second thought, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, are you going to rescind the question for you offer? Because that was like a little bit of a bait and switch, man. I
What's
gotta,
it?
I you said, do I have a
Yes,
question for
yes.
you? And then you wanted
Do
me
you
to
have
pivot
do
to
you
a
have a
30
question
second
for me?
closer. I got a
Yeah, do you
question
have,
for you.
yeah.
Tell me about now you're a communications pro and like you've worked on stuff over the past couple of years that I was like, oh my God, he's doing some really cool stuff that I wish I was part of. What's your take on just, I mean, social media storms in a tempest in a teapot and all the noise and all the tribalism. I mean, you have to navigate it too, and you're in a different part of the country where, I think those voices can get pretty loud. So talk to me about, give me advice on how you navigate it.
Um, wow, that's a good one. Um, I guess I'll give general advice for anybody, and this ignores whatever your political stripes are. And I have tried to do this for a long time. And by long time, I mean my political, I can admit having voted for Obama. I can also admit having voted for Gary Johnson. So, you can kind of guess where I have been on the political spectrum.
Yeah.
I have always tried to seek out opposing views, and I'm a big fan of the 10th man concept, which,
Yeah.
I worked with a firm actually that um, found the phrase "the 10th man" so potentially offensive that they changed it to the 10th voice, which I thought was a bit much. But the 10th man goes back to the Israel and the Six-Day War
Yeah.
back in 67, I believe it was, where they were blindsided. And what they realized was that there was so much groupthink that they got 9 people in a room and all 9 nodded their head in agreement. And they said, we need this 10th man. We need an additional viewpoint that even if they agree with the other 9, their job is to steelman the argument. I think steelman is another great term that, people are going to start. I hope will start using, which is, all right. You begin by saying they're wrong. I know they're wrong, but what if they're right? What are the reasons that you can pinpoint why they're right? Put together an argument. So the straw man is when you completely misrepresent the other person's argument. The steel man is the opposite. You put together the argument as if you are debating on their side against yourself. And I wish more people would adopt that lens. I wish more people, and the reason I mentioned having voted for Obama and having, voted for Gary Johnson, I wish more people would on the left would actually turn on Fox News every once in a while, knowing you're going to want to throw things through your television, because there are
Hmm.
people on the other side who religiously watch those channels who should turn on MSNBC knowing that they
100%.
may feel like they're going to throw a brick through their television, because you need to understand how people come by these points of view. Um, there's and there's a logic piece, there's an emotion piece. And I think once you get to the point where you understand the difference between what's driving the logic here, what's driving the emotion, I think we see a lot of this going on with the um, the potentially incendiary, 3-letter word that is ICE, because some people are like, and I just saw someone, on TV actually being interviewed on Sky News, which is a whole other viewpoint. the whole other idea of getting another viewpoint is watching British TV and
Yeah,
hearing what they're
absolutely.
thinking about. But this individual was some Washington person of some sort who was saying, you need to abolish ICE, need to get rid of it, need to completely tear it down, all that. Um, and the this is this is all well and good, but the flip side to that needs to be considered. And the second and third order impacts of doing that need to be considered as well. And but the flip side to that is what would cause somebody to say that, and what are the reasons why they would have that argument, and if they are having that argument, what is a what is a path that you can take to sort of bridge that argument? Oh, let's tease this out. If this did happen, what would we do next? How would we do this next? And what about the folks over here who say, to your immigrant point earlier, they came here legally. They came here legally and they've done everything right. And now they're watching others not do that. And um, yeah, so it's getting tougher to navigate, but just in general, as I talk to people, yes, trusting the gut, but also considering that there is a point of view that I may not have. There's also a point of view I may not have considered.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
these are important to realize that you need to take into account before willy-nilly. I guess one other piece of advice before willy-nilly just dismissing them. I guess one other piece of advice I would have for anybody is if you find yourself spending so much time on one social platform, at least seek out the polar opposite social platform or a social platform that might have polar opposite points of view. I've always said this. My ex is very my Facebook very left. I cannot spend all of my time on either without understanding what is going on, and having as full a picture as possible of maybe some diplomatic paths to forge down the road.
Yeah. No, I think that's brilliant, man. And it's that having the intellectual curiosity. I don't mean to sound like, you know, intellectual curiosity sounds like such a puffery word, but like to drop yourself, to play that 10th man, to drop yourself into an alternative point of view so you can pressure test your own ideas, right? There are definitely things that I've been exposed to that make me go, oh my gosh, I have not considered that point of view, or I didn't realize things were that way. And, but it's born out of having an opportunity to have that conversation with someone you're sitting across the table with who had a different upbringing or, has a different set of views, but there's enough mutual respect there that I may say something that to your ears sounds like it's set out of ignorance and it's not meant to be hurtful. It's an opportunity to say, hey, you know what? It's interesting you said that. Let me kind of give you an alternative viewpoint there. But you're both in a place where you're listening as much as you're speaking. And I think that's so important. It's so important. It's a missing art. I think it's part of it is a missing art by design, right? Because there's a lot of benefits in having this kind of tribalistic approach. But getting back to the workplace, I think that there are so many things. And when I look at like the super highly effective teams that I've either been part of or led, we had that unifying thread of what are we all working on, and how to within that it doesn't just benefit the business, but what gets me going, what do I love doing within where I can contribute to this project that gets me fired up. And like, my whole thing was when I worked with people and people report directly to me, it's like, I'm going to tell you the target that we need to hit. I'm not going to tell you how to get there because the way I would do it might not be the way that's best for you. And it might be the absolute worst way to get things done. But like, as long as you know where you need to hit, when you need to hit it, and we're checking in and I'm there to give you support, not micromanage you, like the most amazing surprises happen and you level up yourself. And I just think that whether it's career stuff, whether it's politics, whether it's you name it, being in that place where you can have those discussions and you can have that attitude makes all the difference in the world. But it's got to be a two-way street. Otherwise, you're just banging your head against the wall. And there's a lot of value in recognizing that, okay, there will be no open minds on the other end of that discussion today. So we're just going to go over here now and, stay above the fray.
Brilliant. Marc Moschetto, KickMotor. Thank you kindly, fine sir. It's been a pleasure. We'll do this again sometime because most of the time I talk to somebody and it ends up like this. It's like we're going to have to do this again because there's a lot that we can continue to unpack down the road. But
likewise, man, I appreciate you more than you know.
All right.
All right,
Cheers.
take care. Bye.